This is a quick start video demonstrating how you might go about building a quick little model in ProModel. While simulation is normally used to predict the performance of complex systems, in this quick start video we'll take a look at a very simple system. If you're brand new to simulation, you may also want to view the Process Simulator quick start video. ProModel and Process Simulator use the same simulation engine, but Process Simulator is a plugin to Microsoft Visio and it uses the familiar Visio interface. Both products are full-featured discrete event simulation tools, with ProModel being the more feature-rich tool. Today, we will learn how to build this simple model. You'll notice that when you work in ProModel, there is a build menu where you'll be able to find most of the things you'll need to build your model. I'll start with build locations, and this gives me a table where I can define all of the information about each location within my model, and it gives me a graphics library where I can choose what those locations will look like. I'll start by creating an arrival location. I'll click on the counter option and then click on my layout. This will show me how many entities are in a given location anytime. You can see that as I add a graphic on the layout, a new record is added to the table. I'll rename this record to be arrival. Next to the name column, there is a column called capacity. This is where I define how many entities can be processed at a time in a given location. For the arrival location, we'll leave the capacity as infinite. You can also see a checkbox called New. This checkbox links the table with the graphics. Once the new option is checked, every time a new graphics is added to the layout, a new record is created on the table. If the new checkbox is unchecked, I can add multiple graphics to the same location record. I'll add a text box with the name of the arrival location. Now I want to create a new location. I'll check the new checkbox and I'll add a lathe. That creates a new record on the table. I'll now create the buffer location. I'll add a counter and rename it to be buffer. I'll again uncheck the new checkbox and add a label. I'll check back the new option and I'll add my inspect location. Now that I have finished creating my locations, I'll create my entities. I'll go to Build Entities, where I can have a table, where I can define my entities, and a graphics library where I can choose what those entities will look like. In this model, I'll use a gear graphic. You can see that as I click on the entity graphic, a new record is added to the table. I'll make the entity bigger so we can see on the simulation. Now that I have finished creating my entities, I'll go to Build Arrivals. The arrivals will indicate where, how many, when, and how often entities arrive in the simulation model. To create an arrival record, you can click on the entity from the entities list on the left-hand side of the screen, and then click on the location where the entity will arrive. In this model, the entities will arrive at the arrival location. This automatically creates an arrival record on the arrivals table. As you can see on the record, the column entity indicates which entities arrive. In this model, the entity is gear. The column location indicates where the entity arrives. In this case, we have the location arrivals. The column quantity each indicates how many will arrive at a time. In our model, we will have one entity arrive at a time. The column first time will indicate when the first one will arrive. In this model, it will be at 0 minutes, or right at the start of the simulation. The column occurrences indicates how many entities will arrive during the simulation. When we put infinite, that means that as long as the simulation is running, there will be entities arriving. The frequency column indicates how often the entities will arrive. I will change this to be 5 minutes. I could also add logic in the logic field if I wanted to add some special characteristics or attributes, but for the simple model, we'll leave that blank. Now that we have finished creating the arrivals, we can create our processing, which is the flow of entities in the model. When we are at processing, you can see that there are two tables. The processing table on the left-hand side of the screen is where I'll define what happened to the entity in every location, or what processing is performed. The routing table on the right-hand side is where I'll define the location where the entity will go after having finished its processing. To create routes, you just need to click on the location where the entity is coming from, and then on the location where the entity is going to. As we create routes, records are automatically created on the table. You can see that when I clicked on Arrival, a record was created on the Process table, and then when I clicked on Lathe, a record was created on the Routing table. I will continue creating my routes from Lathe to Buffer, and then from Buffer to Inspect. After Inspect, I want my entities to leave the system. In order to do this, I click on Inspect, and then on the left-hand side of the screen, I click on Route to Exit. Now that I know the flow of entities, I'll add my processing times. I don't want any processing to be performed at the arrival location. Thus, I'll leave the operation blank. At Lathe, I want my entities to be processed for 4 minutes. In order to add processing times, we need to click on the Operation button on the Process table. That will open the operation window where I can add logic to each record. In order to do that, I'm going to use the statement called wait. I'll type wait 4 minutes. In ProModel, the wait statement means processing. I want the same processing to be performed at Inspect. I'll click on the Inspect record and I'll add wait 4 minutes. You can see that as I type in the code, a window pops up displaying a list of all of the statements that are available in ProModel. Also, I want to add some move times to my model. I want my entities to move for 1 minute between locations. I can add move times by clicking on the button Move Logic on the Routing table. That will open the Move Logic window where I can add logic to each record. So I'll use the move for statement. I'll type in move for 1 minute. And I'll add the same statement to all the other routes. Now that we have finished our processing, we can add our simulation time by going to Simulation Options. This model will run for 2 hours. Now let's run the simulation. Now that the simulation is over, we can take a look at the results. You can see that entities spent 11 minutes in the system. As there wasn't variability in the system, it would be very easy to calculate the total time in the system without using simulation. It took 1 minute for the entities to move from arrival to lathe, then 4 minutes for the entities to be processed at lathe, 1 minute to move from lathe to buffer, another minute to move from buffer to inspect, and 4 minutes for the entities to be processed at inspect. giving a total of 11 minutes as we were able to see in the results. Now let's add some variability to this model. Let's change our processing times to follow a uniform distribution with mean 4 and half range 1. That means that my processing time will vary between 3 and 5 minutes. I'll do the same for the inspect location. Let's run the simulation again and see the results. Now that we have added some variability to the model, it's much harder to predict results, even in a very simple model such as this. As we add more stations, entity types that will have different processing times in different locations, more resources, equipment to move entities from one location to the other, downtimes, and setup times, we make our model much more complex. Simulation can help us predict those complex systems, as it is a tool that allows us to define our system, breaking down the steps to represent the variability within each part of the system, put them together in this larger simulation model, and run experiments on the system to determine if our proposed changes were actually effective. If you'd like more information about ProModel, you may wish to view our ProModel tutorial or give us a call, and we'll be happy to set up an individual one-on-one demonstration to show you how ProModel can help you and your particular industry.